This is the History of New Zealand podcast on the Eat to My Own Beat podcast network.
Imagine becoming the leader of a country and then losing power just 13 days later. That's exactly what happened to Henry Sewell in 1856, when he became New Zealand's first premier and then watched his government collapse faster than most people change jobs. Today, we're diving into New Zealand's first responsible government, how a one-month ministry in 1856 transformed a British colony into a functioning democracy, why it almost failed before it started, and what this messy experiment teaches us about building democratic institutions. By the end of this episode, you'll understand how modern parliamentary democracy actually works and why accountability matters more than you might think. So let's start with the basics. What exactly was happening in New Zealand before 1856 that made this change so revolutionary?
Well, between 1840 and 1856, New Zealand was ruled by a governor appointed by Britain. The governor had dual roles, representing both the British government and New Zealand views back to Britain. But here's the key thing. Government ministers were only accountable to the governor, not to any elected parliament.
So, basically one person had all the power?
Exactly. And the settlers hated it. They wanted the same rights they'd had in Britain, to elect representatives and have those representatives form the government. The New Zealand Constitution Act of 1852 created the first parliament, called the General Assembly of New Zealand, but it still wasn't truly democratic.
What do you mean by not truly democratic?
Well, they had elections in 1853, but to vote you had to be a male property owner, either owning land worth £50 or holding a lease worth £10. The first parliament had 37 members elected by just 5,849 voters, of which around 100 were Maori.
Wait, only 5,849 voters for the entire country?
Remember, the total European population was only about 30,000 at this point. But here's what's really wild. They also created 6 provincial governments, each with their own elected councils and superintendents. So New Zealand had given itself 6 miniature parliaments, all trying to emulate Westminster.
6 separate parliaments for 30,000 people? That seems ambitious.
It was completely over the top. The provinces were Auckland, Taranaki, Wellington, Nelson, Canterbury, and Otago. They were scattered across a country larger than Great Britain, with no roads, railways, or regular shipping connecting them. Each province basically operated like its own little state.
So you had this elaborate democratic structure, but the real power still sat with the governor?
Precisely. When Parliament first met in Auckland in May 1854, they immediately passed a resolution demanding responsible and representative government, meaning the power to appoint an executive council with actual decision-making powers.
And how did that go over?
Terribly. The administrator Robert Wynyard formed an executive council led by James FitzGerald, but when it became clear the ministers had no real power, they resigned after just 7 weeks. Wynyard then prorogued Parliament because members refused to accept his claim that responsible government needed royal assent.
So there was this standoff between the elected representatives and the appointed officials?
Exactly. According to the page content, the years between 1853 and 1856 were described as difficult. The governor's appointed officials clung to office, while inexperienced politicians squabbled over parochial issues.
It sounds like a recipe for chaos.
It really was. But late in 1854, London finally approved self-government. Governor Thomas Gore Browne prorogued Parliament in 1855 to prepare for elections the following year. That's when Henry Sewell enters the picture.
Tell me about Sewell. Who was this guy who became New Zealand's first premier?
Henry Sewell was a fascinating character, born in 1807 on the Isle of Wight, trained as a solicitor like his father, but his life was marked by financial disaster and personal tragedy. In 1840, his father lost a staggering sum when a bank failed and died shortly after, leaving the family in massive debt.
That's rough. How did he end up in New Zealand?
It gets worse. In 1844, his wife Lucinda died, leaving him with 6 children. He remarried in 1850 to Elizabeth Kitto and decided to emigrate to New Zealand for better financial prospects. He worked for the Canterbury Association, which was colonizing the Canterbury region.
So he came to New Zealand essentially as a refugee from his own financial problems?
In many ways, yes. He arrived in 1853 to wind up the Canterbury Association's affairs, opened a solicitor's office, and became a member of the House of Representatives in 1854. The page content describes him as witty and well-read, but also too reserved and elitist for the rough and tumble of colonial politics.
That doesn't sound like ideal qualifications for a premier.
Well, on May 7, 1856, Sewell became New Zealand's first premier, though the title was actually Colonial Secretary back then. From that date, he held office as the equivalent of a prime minister. But here's the thing, his ministry lasted only until May 20th.
Wait, so he was premier for just 13 days?
The ministry formed on April 18th and lasted until May 20th, so about a month total. But Sewell only held the premier role from May 7th. According to Britannica, he resigned on May 13th because his ministry failed to obtain sufficient support in the House.
So New Zealand's first responsible government was also its first government to fall?
Exactly. But here's what made it revolutionary. Even though it failed quickly, it established the principle that ministers had to be accountable to Parliament, not just the governor. The page content emphasizes that unlike previous executives, its members were held accountable to Parliament.
So what exactly did responsible government mean in practice?
According to the New Zealand Parliament's own documentation, responsible government meant three specific things. First, members of the Executive Council had to be elected members of the House of Representatives. Second, the governor had to act only on the advice of the government. And third, the government had to have the confidence, meaning majority support, of the House.
That sounds like the basic structure of modern parliamentary democracy.
Exactly. The page content notes that this would form the basis for future governments in New Zealand. The heads of department, who had previously been officials on the Executive Council, were replaced by members of Parliament who became ministers.
But I'm guessing it wasn't complete self-government?
You're absolutely right. The page content notes that the term responsible requires qualification. Honours, awards, diplomatic relations, and external defence remained imperial responsibilities. The Colonial Law's Validity Act of 1865 meant any colonial law deemed repugnant to imperial statutes could be overruled.
So Britain kept control of the big stuff?
Especially defence and Mamani affairs. Governor Gore Browne kept control of policy in these crucial areas, which, according to the page content, set up tensions between Government House and politicians that lasted for more than a decade.
That makes sense. You can't have true democracy if the most important decisions are still made by an unelected governor.
And there were thousands of British troops stationed in New Zealand, paid for by British taxpayers. The governor alone was responsible to the Queen for the tranquility of the colony, which would be endangered by the ordinary change of opinions that comes with changing governments.
So even with responsible government, there were still these fundamental tensions built into the system?
Absolutely. And it shows in some of the later governors. The page content mentions Sir Arthur Gordon, who served from 1880 to 1882 and did not want the job. He said he was very greatly mortified by his appointment and preferred Crown colonies where he could call the shots.
He sounds delightful.
He candidly admitted he was exceeding unfit for all the social work. Laying first stones of public buildings, making little speeches, opening athenaeums, attending races, presiding at charity dinners, and entertaining large parties of stupid people. He upset people, squabbled with his ministers, and left after 18 months.
That's actually hilarious. A governor who hated governing.
And then there was Lord Glasgow from 1892 to 1897, described as our most foolish governor. A colonial paper said he was unknown to fame and was ill-suited to his job. He clashed frequently with ministers, even after London ordered him to follow ministerial advice.
It sounds like the system was still working out the kinks decades later.
Exactly. But what's remarkable is that despite all these tensions and failures, the principle established by Sewell's brief ministry held. The idea that government ministers must be accountable to elected representatives became the foundation of New Zealand's democracy.
What happened to Sewell after his government fell?
He continued in politics, serving as colonial treasurer from 1856 to 1859, attorney general from 1861 to 1862, and twice as Minister of Justice. But the page content notes he was more of a sojourner than a settler. He spent 17 years in New Zealand across 3 periods, but never put down deep roots.
So he kept coming and going?
Yes, and he was opposed to the use of force against Mamoni. He was highly distressed by the outbreak of war in Taranaki in 1860 and resigned from government in protest at the land confiscation policy. He left politics in 1873 and returned to England, where he died 6 years later.
So he had principles, even if his government was short-lived.
Absolutely. And it's worth noting that New Zealand's path to full independence was incredibly gradual. According to Te Ara Encyclopedia, New Zealand achieved self-government and independence from Britain through a series of small steps rather than a single large stride.
How gradual are we talking?
New Zealand was a colony from 1840 to 1907, then a dominion until 1945, became a separate monarchical realm in 1953, and ties with the British Parliament weren't severed until 1986. Connection with British courts continued until 2003.
2003? That's incredibly recent.
Right? The page content notes that New Zealand does not have an Independence Day to celebrate because independence was gained in many small steps. As historian J.C. Beaglehole noted in 1954, New Zealand managed to act as an independent nation without being independent.
So when you step back from all this, what's the real significance of that one-month government in 1856?
It established the fundamental principle of democratic accountability. Even though Sewell's government failed quickly, it proved that ministers could be held responsible to elected representatives rather than just appointed governors. That principle became the foundation for everything that followed.
And it shows that democracy is messy and experimental, especially in the beginning.
Exactly. New Zealand was literally learning how to govern while governing. They had 6 provincial parliaments, inexperienced politicians squabbling over local issues, governors who didn't want to be there, and a premier who lasted 13 days. But somehow, the system worked.
It's actually pretty inspiring when you think about it. Democracy doesn't have to be perfect to be transformative.
And it reminds us that accountability is what makes democracy work. It's not enough to have elections. You need systems that ensure elected officials can actually be held responsible for their decisions. That's what Sewell's brief ministry established.
So the next time you see a government fall or politicians arguing, remember Henry Sewell. Sometimes the most important changes come from the messiest experiments.
Thank you for listening to the History of New Zealand podcast. We're found on YouTube and anywhere else you could find your normal podcasts. Please like, comment, and subscribe, or find us at www.eattomyownbeat.com.